History as it happens, January 13th, 2022. Back to 1776.
There are powerful interests who want us to believe that America is a failed state that should still be defined exclusively by slavery and Jim Crow.
They proclaim solidarity with Black suffering.
But are they really pushing us in a direction that will help our communities thrive?
Those are the voices of 1776 Unites, an initiative of the Woodson Center and its founder, Bob Woodson. He says the 1619 Project is perpetrating a lie about our history, erasing the fact that Black Americans have been inspired to defeat oppression by America's founding principles. Can 1776 unite us, or will it fuel more history wars? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Because I really think that the 1619 Project really hijacked the whole moral authority of the civil rights movement and began to redefine America's birthright as 1619 and saying that America should be defined as a slaveocracy, almost like a criminal organization.
What comes to mind when you think of 1776? For me, it's John Trumbull's magnificent oil painting. You know, the one depicting the presentation of the draft of the Declaration of Independence to the Continental Congress. The one showing a room full of white male elites in their wigs, stoically moving history toward freedom. Well, that is exactly what the New York Times 1619 Project does not want you to think of when reflecting on our history, as we have discussed on this podcast many times before. In fact, our most listened to episode, published in early December 2021, when I interviewed historian James Oakes about the 1619 Project's pseudo-history. Now, while many scholars on the left, such as Oakes, have attacked the New York Times' award-winning work, so have many scholars, intellectuals, and activists on the right. These conservatives also believe the 1619 Project is tendentious, cynical, and some of them have published what their editor calls a counter-narrative.
And we wanted to describe in detail why the founding principles were critical to Black survival in surviving slavery and Jim Crow.
Bob Woodson is the founder of the Woodson Center, a veteran activist and organizer, and our conversation is coming up in a moment. Woodson is the force behind the 1776 Unites initiative. You can check it out at 1776unites.com. Woodson's team of scholars and activists published a compilation of essays aimed at correcting the 1619 Project's distortions. That book is titled Red, White, and Black: Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. Now, given the current climate, it might be impossible to unite Americans around a shared story, a shared origin narrative. Most societies, most nations spar over their past, so we're no different there. The disagreements can range from the trivial or petty to the big stuff, and that is where we are in the United States today. The very meaning of the American founding is being contested. Now, that can be a good thing. It can inspire us to start reading more, debating, and discussing more. It can also lead to more confusion, more division, especially if whatever narrative you subscribe to has the aim of, say, promoting patriotism or serving a political cause like reparations. History should challenge us without resorting to patriotism or cynicism. And enough out of me. Bob Woodson, welcome to the podcast.
Pleased to be here.
We're delighted to have you, and for the benefit of our audience, I'd like to start by clarifying something, because on several of my recent podcasts, I have discussed the 1619 Project, and I've referenced the 1776 Commission that was formed by Donald Trump. Your initiative, 1776 Unites, has nothing to do with that defunct commission by the former president, right?
Absolutely. We have no connection or affiliation with it at all. Ours started over 2 years ago, and we have a collection of scholars, not all right of center, some left of center, but all committed to the founding virtues and values of the nation. And that's the basis upon which we recruited people to write about this.
Thank you for clarifying that. In a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, Jason Riley described you as a veteran community activist who broke with the traditional civil rights leadership in the 1970s after realizing that the agenda of racial grievance groups like the NAACP, according to Mr. Riley, was increasingly at odds with the actual wants and needs of the black underclass. For the benefit of our audience who may not be entirely familiar with your background and work, would you say that's an accurate description of your background?
It really is. As a young civil rights leader in Westchester, Pennsylvania, 30 miles west of Philadelphia, that's the home of Barrett Rustin, a principal advisor to Dr. King. And I met Dr. King through Barrett Rustin. But I parted company with the civil rights movement over the issue of forced busing for integration. I believe that the opposite of segregation is desegregation and not integration. And so that put me at odds with the civil rights leadership at the time. I also broke on the issue of low-income blacks that we demonstrated for months outside of a pharmaceutical company. When they desegregated, they hired 9 black PhD chemists. When we asked them to join our movement, they said they got these jobs because they were qualified, not because of any sacrifices we made. And I realized then that the many suffered most did not benefit from the change. And so I left the civil rights movement and began to work on behalf of low-income people of all groups. Dr. King said, what good does it do to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you're choosing or live where you wish, if you don't have the means to exercise that right? So I concentrated my time and energy in not just removing external barriers, but helping people to internally prepared to live free. And that's what my life's work has taken me into low-income communities of all races and ethnicities to help promote upward mobility from within those communities.
So a couple of years ago, you founded the 1776 Unites project, which is a project of the Woodson Center. You've also said that you didn't do it to engage in a debate or a point-by-point refutation or argument with the 1619 Project. Why did you establish 1776 Unites?
Because I really think that the 1619 Project really hijacked the whole moral authority of the civil rights movement and began to redefine America's birthright as 1619 and saying that America should be defined as a slavetocracy, almost like a criminal organization. And they go on to argue that as a consequence that slavery and capitalism are an extension of white power and white privilege, and therefore all whites are victimizers and all black are victims. And so therefore, they conclude that the whole system needs to be reconstituted. And so we took strong issue with that, but we didn't want to engage in a point-by-point debate. We wanted to offer a counter-narrative. And we wanted to describe in detail why the founding principles were critical to Black survival in surviving slavery and Jim Crow. It was the values of the nation that caused us to be able to resist oppression. And so that's what our scholars, not just scholars, but activists, because we believe that one of the best ways to convince people of the value of a set of principles or virtues is to see it demonstrated in the lives of people. In our essays, we talk about how do we reflect on the fact that when whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best.
You do not deny the importance of slavery in American history. You're saying that there is no trans-historical, unbreakable line of white supremacy that explains everything that has happened since the institution.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I will say this about, and where I think the 1619 Project got it right, that America has understated the impact that slavery has had. In fact, in order for conservatives to speak authoritatively and morally on it, I think they have to acknowledge that slavery was revised. For instance, in one conservative group that I addressed a few weeks back, I was really pleased that they talked about in Virginia in 1972. All textbooks had to be used that were produced by the state. And in those textbooks for 20 years, students were taught that slavery was like a benign institution, that there was like a giant welfare system. And so I think in order for anyone who is a critic of 1619 to be heard, I think it's important for them to acknowledge that 1619 was right in that slavery was underreported and de-emphasized for the cruel institution that it was. But we don't need to replace one set of revisionist history with another one. And 1619 is a revisionist history of the country.
My own view is that the 1619 Project misses badly. It's concerned only with racial values through American history and leaves out the fight for equality that was born from the American Revolution. So they look at one side of it, pro-slavery sentiment in the Constitution and pro-slavery Americans and the slaveocracy as it came to be known, but they also miss out on, or they underplay, the abolitionist movement and the anti-slavery movement. Do you agree with that?
I really do. And also, they make false claims that somehow the problems facing segments of the Black community today of out-of-wedlock births and the violence and the self-hatred violence that is going on is somehow tied to the legacy of slavery and discrimination, that any inequity today is tied to the legacy of slavery. Well, that's just not true. It is a falsehood. We give examples that between 1930 and 1940, when racism was enshrined in law, and during the Depression, the unemployment rate for whites was 25%, 40% for Blacks. Even in the face of these horrific external economic conditions, the Black community had the highest marriage rate of any group in the country. Elderly people could walk safely in their communities without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. And that is because of our strong Christian faith and also the importance of the nuclear family and the strong belief in self-determination. So we offer evidence to contradict this whole notion that it was a legacy of slavery that has caused the disorganization of the family. We even have one essay that looked at the records of 6 plantations to look at the state of the Black family. 75% of slave families had a man and a woman raising children. So over a century, the nuclear family dominated public life in the Black community, with the consequence it has served as a bulwark against horrific conditions of slavery and discrimination.
Why do you think the 1619 Project has received a warm reception?
I really think that there are people who are ill-willed, who really want to undermine this nation. And I think they need to be distinguished from those who are ill-informed. I think there are many people who are ill-informed, and we're trying to appeal to them with information and also a counter-narrative. But there are forces in our society that would really like to use the rich legacy of the civil rights movement as a bludgeon against this country to undermine our institutions, to undermine our values, and really promote Marxism in this country. I really sincerely believe that's what they're doing.
So you think the authors of the 1619 Project have that in mind? I mean, I think they've made it clear that one purpose is to make an argument for reparations. I don't know if they would agree that they're trying to undermine society.
Well, when you say that, as Hannah Nicole Jones has said, that this country is a slaveocracy and that capitalism is evil and an extension of white supremacy, and that the whole system needs to be changed and turned inside out, what else do you mean?
She recently gave an interview to NPR in which she clarified the main argument of the 1619 Project. She said they're not saying the United States was unique because it denied rights to some of its people. What they did say was the United States is unique because it was the first country founded on the principles of liberty and individual rights, and then denied those rights to many of its people. Do you agree with her there?
No, what she did was lie. I'm going to just tell it plain. When she made the statement that the Revolutionary War was fought to protect slavery, that's what she said unequivocally. And then once she was challenged with facts, the editors of the New York Times made a correction, and she wiped out all of her Twitter accounts where she made that claim. And last week she was saying that that was true. She never made such a claim. But this is part that I find most horrific. The very fact that they revised their explanation of that and said it wasn't true, but the Pulitzer Institute has already spread those lies to all of the various school systems throughout the country. They didn't make those corrections. So children are being taught from a text that even the author said it wasn't true. But there was no effort to correct it in the books that have already been released. I think that's horrific.
I have not taken a look at those school curricula that the Pulitzer Center, I believe it's called. It has nothing to do with the Pulitzer Prize.
No, it's the Pulitzer Center.
But we've taken on that claim on this podcast several times about the notion that, well, now they say some colonists went for independence to preserve slavery. I mean, that's not correct either. They totally botched the American Revolution. In your view, was the Constitution a pro or anti-slavery document? And why does that still matter?
I think the Constitution was designed to be a corrective. It was supposed to be an instrument for which we can then revise and make our republic a more perfect union. So I think it's neutral on that. I think it's been written so that we can make corrections. And that's why Black America has fought in every war that this country has had. And it wasn't because they were deluded. They fought for the promise of America. America is a country of second chances. America is a country of redemption. Dr. King said, as a minority in a majority country, the only security that we have is to ensure that the country lives up to its founding values. I mean, the very fact that the founding fathers personally lost family members and property, I don't believe people do that to protect slavery, even though their own behavior contradict their support for these ideals. Maybe that means that these ideals really didn't come from them, but they were divinely inspired.
Would you say the Constitution was a contested document, that it both protected slavery but laid the groundwork for containing or attacking slavery?
Yes, I think it contains its own contradictions, yeah. But again, it was intended to be an instrument that would allow us to make corrections. And we did with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
I'm glad you brought up the 13th Amendment. What do you make of this idea, which is known as 13therism? If you're a 13ther, you argue that the 13th Amendment didn't actually abolish slavery, but formed a new kind of slavery called convict slavery, although, of course, convicts had been forced to perform labor without being paid for a long time before the 13th Amendment came along. I mean, I think this idea is nonsense. Are you familiar with this idea, this school of thought?
No, I'm not. But I mean, there's always people on the left who claim, for instance, that incarceration rates today somehow are related to the legacy of slavery and discrimination. The fact that we have such a high rate of Black incarceration. Again, if you go look at history, that did not always occur. If you look at the incarceration rates at the turn of the century, when racism was enshrined in law and Blacks were 13% of the population, they were less than 25% represented in our penal system. And this low participation rate or incarceration rate, if there was virulent racism behind incarceration, why weren't you see 60, 70% Black incarceration rate under segregation? It's fairly fascinating that the incarceration rates dramatically went up with the start of the Great Society. What the government did over the last 50 years is something that's racism and Jim Crow didn't do for 100 years.
the Great Society is directly responsible for these things?
Absolutely. I have a paper at the Harvard Policy Review where I carefully document the Black family was intact from the end of slavery. For over 100 plus years, the Black family was a nuclear family, and we were influenced by our Christian values. But when Moynihan reported in the 60s about when that trend started, it was precisely, and when I talk about Cloud and Piven, these were sociologists at Columbia University who were socialists, and they said what we need to redistribute income in America and promote socialism in the nation. But we first must separate work from income that will make the father redundant, and it would produce out of wedlock births. They predicted all of this, but just having a social construct wasn't enough. The federal government came along, and there was a removal of the stigma. There was a stigma in the Black community in the 60s against taking welfare. That stigma was removed, and as a result, the federal government set up offices and recruited people into the welfare system. Fred Siegel, in his book, The Future Once Happened Here, documents the fact that within a period of 5 years in the early 70s, you saw millions of Blacks flooding into the welfare system at a time when the unemployment rate among Blacks in New York was under 4%. And as soon as you saw that influx of people into the welfare system, that's when you saw out of wedlock births began to soar. School dropout rates began to soar. It was supported by the Black Power movement, who believed that the nuclear family was Eurocentric and therefore racist. And it was supported by the government's anti-poverty agency. So you had a tsunami of social forces coming together that had the effect of dramatically producing out of wedlock births in the Black community. Absolutely.
But the Great Society was taken on to ameliorate poverty that already existed. And the other side of that argument is the Great Society would have been more successful had it not been sacrificed on the altar of Vietnam. The federal government spent much more money fighting the war in Vietnam, and Dr. King pointed this out, of course, in his famous address at the church in New York City, than it did on the Great Society.
That's not true. We spent $22 trillion on the war on poverty, $22 trillion. That's more money than we spent on all of the wars that we fought. That's enough money to buy all agricultural land in the country. But 70 cents of every one of those dollars did not go to the poor. They went to those who served the poor. We created a commodity out of poor people by producing a huge professional social service bureaucracy that sought to address problems that were fundable, not problems that were fixable.
What are your thoughts on the current imbroglio over critical race theory? Do you see critical race theory as a problem in schools, in school history classes, or maybe in diversity training seminars?
Critical race theory is one of the most diabolical phenomena to come in a long time. What does success look like on the critical race theory where all whites are defined as oppressors and all Blacks victims? I think, as Delano Spears, one of my colleagues, properly, he said, this whole narrative is being driven by guilty white people who are seeking absolution from crimes they never committed, and entitled Blacks who are seeking absolutions from injustice they never suffered. This is all being driven by elites at the expense of people in these communities. The other message that critical race theory is sending, it's exempting Blacks from any personal responsibility for having to being agents of their own uplift. It's saying that white people are our oppressors, and unless white people are trained to be less racist, we cannot expect our condition to improve. If you believe that, then you believe in white supremacy.
Allow me to reframe my question. I guess what I was getting at was, do you think the CRT issue has been overblown in the grade school or elementary school level?
I think it's insidious. It's being taught.
Okay.
It's creeping into not just schools, but corporations, I know of a friend who belongs to a law firm, and this law firm, each of the managing partners has to sign a sort of a racial grievance document agreeing to certain critical race theory themes. It's being used as a condition of bidding on contracts. It's creating a whole industry out of race grievance trainers. Some race grievance trainers are getting $20,000 for a 1 hour speech. It's insidious.
George Packer, writing in The Atlantic, wrote an essay, "Can Civics Save America? Teaching civics could restore health to American democracy or inflame our mutual antagonisms." The essay is about efforts underway right now to try to reach some common ground so American students can be taught a civics curriculum that can satisfy, to the extent possible, both sides in our culture wars. Do you think that's possible? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I really think we need to be open, and I'm against abolishing or preventing 1619 from being taught. I support a competition of ideas. We have offered to debate Hannah Nicole Jones's whole team, but they have steadfastly refused to debate us and our scholars. I think there needs to be a vigorous public debate and discussion on these issues without people fearing losing their jobs. There really does need to be this kind of debate. The Woodson Centers, when we released our book, Red, White, and Black, on Amazon, it sold out in 2 weeks. We developed a curriculum from K through 12 that was downloaded 26,000 times by school systems and educators in all 50 states. And we're developing an animated series for television that would present some historic characters of some blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires. Only in a capitalist system could you have people born slave and die a millionaire. And two of them purchased a plantation on which they were slaves. And one of them, Robert Smalls, actually took in the destitute family of the slave master. So there is an act of what I call radical grace. And if somebody who was a slave could purchase the plantation and take in a slave family as an act of not just forgiveness, but grace, how can someone making six figures with a degree from Harvard be angrier than Robert Smalls?
That's a good point. I think what this might come down to, not to oversimplify it, is the ability to have two different thoughts in one's head at the same time. Frederick Douglass, who knew as well as anyone what it was like to live under the cruel despotism of slavery, also viewed the U.S. Constitution as what he called a great liberty document.
And I really think if more people were honest and candid about race, they would earn more respect of people rather than cowering in a corner in white guilt. You know, the other side of white guilt is white narcissism.
And my position has been that when it comes to understanding the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and trying to understand our current problems, it might be more helpful to focus on the racism that underpinned those systems, because we still have racism as a problem today.
But it does not define, it's not define everything in our society. It cannot be seen through the, here you got New York governor declaring racism as a national health emergency, when the murder rate for blacks and others in that city are skyrocketing. What the hell does that have to do with racism? 20 years ago, 17,000 young people died of drug overdose. Since then, 100,000 have died. There is a moral and spiritual crisis in America that has nothing to do with race. But we cannot look to the safety of our children if we have to look at every problem through the prism of race. It prevents us from addressing the more fundamental problem, and that is the moral and spiritual freefall and crisis that is consuming children of all races and all classes. And so what we're trying to do at the Woodson Center is bring together the mothers of these fallen children into a consortium so we can come together and share strategies for preventing this free fall from continuing to occur. But in order for us to do that, we've got to take race off of the table.
That might be difficult to do in America today.
But we must do it.
Bob Woodson, we thank you for your perspective, and I'm committed to bringing you, the listeners, as many perspectives as I can on this issue. 1619, 1776, the argument about our origins. If you have a suggestion, you can email me, MDICARO, that is MDicaro, at WashingtonTimes.com. On the next episode of History as It Happens, is it time to say goodbye to NATO?
I've made it absolutely clear to President Putin, it's the last thing I'll say, that if he moves on Ukraine, the economic consequences for his economy are going to be devastating.
Andrew Bacevich joins us to discuss NATO's history, its successes and failures, and whether we need it anymore, as Russia deploys thousands of troops on the Ukrainian border. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.